At 9:42 on the morning of April 11th, 1945, First Lieutenant Merritt D. Francies banked his Piper L-4 Grasshopper over a muddy road near Dannenberg, Germany, watching a German motorcycle with sidecar race east through the trees below. He was 24 years old. He had flown 142 combat missions. He had 0 air-to-air kills, because artillery spotter pilots weren't supposed to fight. Behind him, stretching west through the low clouds and rolling farmland, nearly 500 American tanks and self-propelled guns of the 5th Armored Division advanced east at barely 12 miles per hour. Berlin was less than 50 miles away. The war was collapsing, but men were still dying. Francies flew one of the most fragile aircraft in the war. Fabric stretched over steel tubing. A 65-horsepower engine. Maximum speed 85 miles per hour. No armor. No guns. No radio capable of reaching fighter cover. His job was simple and deadly. Fly low. Spot enemy movement. Radio coordinates to the howitzers. And stay alive. His observer, First Lieutenant William Martin, sat in the rear seat with binoculars and a map board. They had been airborne since 7 o'clock, sweeping roads and tree lines for anything that could threaten the armored column. The motorcycle had appeared 10 minutes earlier, moving fast along a secondary road parallel to the American advance. Francies dropped to 400 feet to confirm what he was seeing. The rider wore a field gray uniform. The man in the sidecar carried what looked like a radio pack. A messenger. If that motorcycle reached a German command post, American tanks would be walking into a prepared kill zone. Then Martin tapped Francies hard on the shoulder and pointed up. 700 feet above them, slipping through the broken clouds, flew a Fiesler Phi 156 Storch. Francies recognized it instantly. High-wing monoplane. Fixed landing gear. Excellent low-speed handling. The Luftwaffe's equivalent of the Grasshopper. An artillery spotter. The Storch flew west, directly toward the advancing American armor. Francies pulled back on the stick and began climbing. The Grasshopper responded slowly. Fabric rippled. The engine strained. Martin kept his binoculars locked on the German aircraft. The Storch's crew hadn't seen them yet. If that aircraft got through, it would radio exact coordinates for every Sherman, every Priest, every fuel truck in the column. German artillery would do the rest. Francies didn't need to imagine the outcome. He'd seen it before. September 19, 1944. Near Ercourt, German observers spotted American armor. 30 minutes later, 88mm shells erased an entire company. 11 tanks destroyed. 27 men killed. He considered calling for help, but American fighters flew at 10,000 feet or higher. By the time they descended, the Storch would be gone, and the coordinates already transmitted. The Grasshopper wasn't armed. Army doctrine didn't allow weapons on observation planes. Too heavy, too dangerous, too slow. But both Francies and Martin carried standard issue M1911, 45 caliber pistols, 7 rounds per magazine, 1 spare each, 28 bullets total. Francies looked at the Storch, then at the road below, then at the tanks advancing blindly east. He made his decision. He unlatched his cockpit door. Wind exploded into the cabin. Behind him, Martin did the same. Both doors swung open against the slipstream. Francies drew his pistol and chambered around. Martin followed suit. The Grasshopper climbed toward the Storch at 60 miles per hour. 2 men in a fabric-covered plane. 2 pistols. 1 enemy aircraft. Francies pushed the throttle forward and dove. The Grasshopper dropped 300 feet in seconds. The Storch filled the windshield. 500 feet. 400. 300. The German crew still hadn't looked down. At 200 feet, Francies leveled out and slid in behind the Storch. 80 yards. 60. 40. He could see the observer through the rear canopy. See the black crosses on the wings. See scratches in the fabric from flying low through trees. At 20 yards, Martin fired first. 3 sharp cracks. Francies fired immediately after. The pistol bucked in his hand. Brass casings flew past his face into open air. The Storch kept flying. Then the German pilot saw them. The Storch banked hard left. Francies yanked the stick and followed. The Grasshopper turned inside the German aircraft's radius. The Storch was faster, but the Grasshopper could turn tighter. The fight spiraled upward. 500 feet. 600, 700. The German pilot tried to climb away. Francies stayed glued to his tail. His slide locked back, empty. He had to reload, but he needed both hands to fly. Francies jammed the control stick between his knees. The plane wobbled. He dropped the empty magazine, watched it vanish toward the fields below, and slammed in a fresh one. The nose dipped. He grabbed the stick with his left hand and pulled back. Altitude lost, maybe 50 feet, but the Storch hadn't escaped. Behind him, Martin finished reloading. The German pilot stopped running. He started fighting. The Storch turned, climbed, dove, trying to shake them. It didn't work. The Grasshopper stayed within 50 yards, then 30, close enough to see faces. Francies fired. Martin fired. Cracks echoed over the engine noise. A spiderweb appeared in the Storch's windshield. Then another. The German aircraft dipped, rolled, shuddered. Francies fired again until his slide locked back, empty. Martin kept shooting. Rounds tore into the Storch's right wing and engine cowling. The fight was no longer theoretical. A man in a canvas-covered liaison plane was attacking a military aircraft with a pistol, because if he didn't, hundreds of Americans would die. The Storch's propeller stuttered. A thin puff of black smoke escaped from the engine cowling, barely visible at first, but unmistakable. The German pilot reacted instantly. He shoved the nose down and dived toward the trees. Francies followed. The two aircraft plunged through the morning air. 600 feet. 500, 400. The smoke trail thickened. The Storch wasn't running anymore. It was crashing on purpose. The German pilot aimed for a narrow clearing beside the road, trying to save the aircraft, trying to save his crew. Francies stayed 30 feet behind the tail, close enough to see fabric rippling and oil streaking along the fuselage. Martin kept his pistol trained through the open door, but didn't fire. Both magazines were empty now. 28 rounds. All expended. The fight in the air was over. At 100 feet, the Storch leveled out. Despite the damage, the German pilot flew it in clean, steady hands, disciplined control. The fixed landing gear touched grass. The wheels rolled. Then the right wingtip caught the ground. The aircraft pivoted violently. Metal shrieked. Fabric tore. The landing gear collapsed. The propeller struck dirt and exploded into splinters, wooden blades flying in all directions. The fuselage twisted once, then stopped. The engine died. Silence replaced the scream of tearing metal. Smoke drifted from the cowling, but no fire followed. The Storch sat broken in the clearing, crippled, but intact. Francies circled once. The clearing was roughly 200 yards long, wide enough for a grasshopper. Soft ground. No visible obstacles. He dropped to 50 feet and lined up his approach. Only then did the reality hit him. He had no idea where he was. The chase had taken minutes of climbing, diving, spiraling. Landmarks were gone. Headings lost. The 5th Armored Division was somewhere west. Maybe 3 miles. Maybe 5. Maybe 10. And Francies was about to land inside Germany, east of American lines, in territory that might still hold Wehrmacht units, or fanatics, or nothing at all. He didn't know. The Grasshopper touched down 70 yards from the wrecked Storch. Francies cut the engine. The propeller windmilled to a stop. He and Martin climbed out immediately. Both drew their pistols. Both pistols were empty, but the Germans wouldn't know that. They advanced toward the wreck. Mud sucked at their boots. The air smelled of fuel and burned oil. Movement inside the Storch. The canopy was intact. Someone was alive. The German pilot forced his door open. It stuck halfway, then gave. He climbed onto the wing and dropped to the ground. A Feldwebel, a sergeant. Early 30s. No visible injuries. He stood beside the wreckage and raised both hands. The observer followed. Younger, maybe 22. He tried to step down from the wing. His right leg buckled. He collapsed into the mud beside the landing gear and didn't get up. Francies and Martin closed the distance. 30 feet. 20. The pilot kept his hands raised. He wasn't reaching for a weapon. Wasn't running. Just standing there. But Francies kept glancing at the tree line. They were alone in a clearing somewhere in Germany. 2 American officers. 2 German aircrew. No radio contact. No backup. And somewhere beyond those trees, there could be more German soldiers. The observer was bleeding. Francies saw it clearly now. The right boot was soaked dark. A bullet wound, probably from Martin's last burst into the cabin. The pilot shouted urgently in German, pointing at the wounded man, then at the blood. Martin kept his empty pistol aimed at the pilot's chest. Francies knelt beside the wounded observer. The young German was pale, shaking, eyes wide with fear. He was expecting to die. Francies pulled out his first aid kit. Sulfa powder, bandages, morphine syringe, standard issue. He cut the boot away with his pocket knife. The bullet had entered just above the ankle and exited through the sole. Clean through. No shattered bone. No severed artery. But it was bleeding heavily, and the man couldn't walk. Francies poured sulfa powder into both wounds. The observer flinched but didn't scream. Francies wrapped the foot tightly, enough to slow bleeding, not enough to cut circulation. The pilot watched silently, hands still raised. The situation was stable. For the moment. Francies checked his watch. 9:58. They had been on the ground 6 minutes. The 5th Armored Division was still advancing somewhere west. Then a sound came from the trees. Voices. German voices. Francies froze. Martin heard them too. Branches snapped. Boots on leaves. Multiple men, 4 or 5 at least, moving toward the clearing. The German pilot heard them. His eyes widened. He spoke rapidly, urgently, pointing at the trees, then at Francies and Martin, then west. Francies didn't need translation. German soldiers were coming. Martin grabbed Francis's arm and pointed toward the Grasshopper. They could be airborne in under a minute. Escape was easy, but Francies looked down at the wounded observer, at the bandages he had just tied, at a terrified young man who couldn't move. Leaving him wasn't just abandoning an enemy. It was signing his death warrant. The voices were closer now. 50 yards. Francies made his decision. He hooked his arms under the wounded observer's shoulders and lifted. Martin instantly grabbed the man's legs. Together, they carried him toward the Grasshopper. The German pilot followed, hands still raised, watching 2 American officers carry his wounded crewman toward safety instead of away from it. They reached the plane. Time was gone. The choice was made. They reached the Grasshopper in 40 seconds. The wounded observer weighed close to 160 pounds, dead weight. His injured foot dragged through the mud. He was conscious, eyes wide, breathing hard, but he wasn't helping. Shock had already taken him. Terror too. From his perspective, 2 enemy officers had shot down his aircraft and were now dragging him toward theirs. Martin climbed into the rear seat. Francies and the German pilot lifted the wounded man together. Martin grabbed him under the arms and hauled him into the cramped cabin. There was barely enough room. The L-4 was designed for 2 men with maps and binoculars, not 3 men, one of them wounded and bleeding. The voices in the trees were closer now. 40 yards. German words carried clearly, commands, questions. Someone was shouting, probably calling out to see if anyone had survived the crash. The German pilot stood beside the wing, looking at Francies, then at the trees, then at his wounded observer crammed into the back seat of an American aircraft. He could run, disappear into the trees, rejoin his own troops, warn them that 2 Americans were trying to take off from the clearing. Francies pointed at the open front seat. The pilot hesitated 3 seconds, then climbed in. Francies followed, forcing himself into the seat behind him. 2 men in a cockpit built for one. The pilot sat half on Francis's lap, arms pinned, no room to move, no way to fight. The cockpit smelled of fuel, blood, and fear. Francies reached around the pilot and grabbed the control stick. Right hand, throttle forward. The little Continental engine coughed once, twice, then caught. The propeller spun up. The Grasshopper shook. Figures burst from the tree-line. 5 German soldiers. Wehrmacht uniforms. Rifles. One carrying a Panzerfaust. They saw the aircraft. Saw the Americans. Saw the engine running. They started shouting and running. Francies released the brake. The Grasshopper rolled. Slow at first. Then faster. 30 miles per hour. 40. The German soldiers were 100 yards away, sprinting. One dropped to a knee and raised his rifle. 50 miles per hour. Francies pulled back on the stick. The Grasshopper lifted. Mud fell away beneath them. 20 feet. 30. A rifle cracked behind them. Francies didn't look back. He just climbed. 60 feet. 80. 100. The clearing vanished below the trees. The soldiers shrank into dots. Another shot echoed, then nothing. The Grasshopper climbed west at 500 feet per minute. Francies checked his watch. 10:07. They had been on the ground 15 minutes. The German pilot sat rigid in his lap, staring forward, saying nothing. Behind them, Martin held the wounded observer upright. The young man's head lolled against Martin's shoulder, still breathing, still alive. 12 minutes later, Francies spotted them. American tanks. A column of Shermans moving east along a road below. He circled once, wagged his wings, dropped to 200 feet, and searched for a landing spot. A flat field north of the road. Soft ground, but usable. The Grasshopper touched down at 10:21. Francies cut the engine. Tank crews were already running toward them. A sergeant with a Thompson. 3 privates with M1 rifles. They surrounded the plane, weapons raised. Francies climbed out first, the German pilot still in front of him. Hands up, clearly American, clearly in control. Martin climbed out next and helped the wounded observer down from the rear seat. The young German nearly collapsed. Martin caught him and eased him into the grass. The sergeant stared at the scene, the tiny observation plane, the 2 German aircrew, the blood-soaked bandages. Francies explained in 30 seconds. Chased a Storch, shot it down with pistols, landed, treated the wounded, evaded German troops, brought prisoners back. The sergeant nodded. He'd seen stranger things in the last 11 months. 2 men escorted the prisoners to division intelligence. Another handed Francies and Martin canteens. They drank. As the wounded observer was led away, he looked back at Francies and spoke. Francies didn't understand the words, but he understood the meaning. Thank you. For the bandages. For not leaving him to bleed in the mud. For saving his life. Francies never learned his name. Never learned the pilot's either. Never knew what became of them. They vanished into the prisoner system. 2 more names among millions. But for 15 minutes in a muddy clearing near Dannenberg, they had been something else. Not enemies. Just wounded men, and the men who chose to help them. Francies and Martin returned to the 71st Armored Field Artillery Battalion at 11:15. The Grasshopper landed on a widened dirt road serving as a forward strip. 3 other L-4s sat under camouflage netting. Mechanics worked nearby, patching fabric torn by ground fire. The battalion operations officer listened to Francis's report without interrupting. Then he told him to write it up. Full account. Times. Locations. Facts only. Francies spent 2 hours writing. No drama. No embellishment. Just what happened. He turned it in at 13:30. The war ended weeks later. The recommendation for the Distinguished Flying Cross went up the chain and disappeared into the machinery of demobilization. No ceremony. No medal. Just a typed report in a file somewhere. And a German artillery observer who went home alive because 2 men in a fabric airplane decided not to leave him behind. The Distinguished Flying Cross never came. Merritt Dwayne Francies received other awards. A Bronze Star for rescuing a wounded forward observer in September 1944. An Air Medal for sustained operational flights against the enemy. Both were legitimate. Both were deserved. Neither was for shooting down an enemy aircraft with a pistol. In October 1945, the 5th Armored Division sailed home. Francies arrived at Camp Kilmer, New Jersey, on October 2nd. The division was officially inactivated 9 days later. Soldiers scattered. Some stayed in uniform. Most went home. Francies went home. Back to Walla Walla, Washington. Back to civilian life. Back to a world without low-altitude chases, collapsing engines, and pistol duels at 700 feet. He married Joan Hollison in March 1947. He found work. Built a life. The war slowly became something that had happened years ago. The Storch became a story. He told it sometimes, at reunions, at veterans' gatherings. When people asked what he had done in the war, he talked about chasing a German observation plane, firing a .45 from an open cockpit, landing behind enemy lines, bandaging a wounded enemy airman, and escaping under rifle fire. Cornelius Ryan was writing The Last Battle, a massive study of the war's final weeks in Europe. He interviewed hundreds of veterans, American, British, German, Russian. He dug through archives, after-action reports, unit histories, personal statements. Someone mentioned Francies. Said he had shot down a German plane with a pistol. Ryan investigated. He found the April 11th, 1945 after-action report. He found witness statements. He found the original Distinguished Flying Cross recommendation, never approved, never denied, simply abandoned. Ryan included the story in his book. Not a chapter, just a few pages. But he included everything that mattered. The Storch, the pistols, the forced landing, the wounded German airmen, the escape. And in a footnote, Ryan wrote the quiet truth. Lieutenant Merritt D. Francies was recommended for the Distinguished Flying Cross, but never received the award. The last battle became a bestseller. Hundreds of thousands of Americans read about Berlin's fall, Hitler's suicide, the Reich's collapse, and some read about a lieutenant from Washington state who shot down a German plane with A-45 and never received his medal. One of those readers was Senator Henry "Scoop" Jackson. Jackson represented Washington. He had served in Congress since 1941. He understood war. He understood bureaucracy. He understood how records vanished and how men who deserved recognition sometimes disappeared into paperwork. In early 1967, Jackson's office contacted Francies. Was the story true? Had he really never received the medal? Did he want the record corrected? Francies answered honestly. Yes, yes, and yes. He would appreciate the help. Jackson went to work. His staff pulled files from the National Archives. They found the original recommendation dated April 24, 1945. They found supporting statements from Major William Martin. They found the battalion commander's endorsement. They traced the paperwork through 5th Armored Division headquarters. The recommendation had been approved at division level, forwarded to 9th Army headquarters in May 1945. And there it stopped. Not rejected. Not denied. Just stopped. 9th Army was dissolving. Units were shipping home. Offices were closing. Someone likely set the file aside intending to finish it later and never did. Jackson pressed the Department of Defense. Letters. Phone calls. Weekly follow-ups. The bureaucracy moved slowly, but it moved. By February 1967, the Distinguished Flying Cross was officially approved. On March 13, 1967, Captain Merritt Dwayne Francies stood at Holman Field in St. Paul, Minnesota. He was 45 years old now. A commercial pilot. A husband. A father. A civilian who hadn't worn a wartime uniform in 22 years. But that day, he wore it again. Old Army greens. Ribbons on his chest. Captain's bars on his shoulders. He had stayed in the Army Reserve after the war. He had been promoted twice. He had never stopped being a soldier, only waiting for the record to catch up. 22 years late, the medal finally found him. Major General Lucius D. Clay stood in front of him. Clay was not chosen by accident. He was the general who would later command the Berlin airlift, the man who understood what it meant to fly dangerous missions in small, vulnerable aircraft where survival depended more on judgment than firepower. In his hands was the Distinguished Flying Cross, a blue ribbon edged in red and white, a bronze cross with propeller blades set at the angles. Simple, unadorned. 22 years late. Clay pinned the medal to Merritt Dwayne Francies' chest, shook his hand, and spoke quietly about extraordinary achievement, about heroism, about an action that reflected the best of American soldiers. Francies stood at attention. He said thank you. He said it was an honor. He said he had only been doing his job. From a muddy clearing near Dannenberg, Germany, to an airfield in Minnesota. From combat to recognition. From war to peace. The medal felt light in his hand. But it felt right. After 1967, the story became known. Not famous. Not legendary. But known. Aviation historians wrote about it. Military journals published analyses. The Distinguished Flying Cross Society recorded Francies as one of the most unusual aerial victories in American history. But what made it extraordinary was not the pistols, not the fabric aircraft, not the crash landing or the escape from German troops in the trees. What made it extraordinary was the choice. On the morning of April 11, 1945, Francies had options. He could have radioed for fighters. He could have followed the Storch at a distance. He could have marked its position and let artillery handle it. All of those were reasonable choices. Safe choices. But they would have taken time. And time meant the Storch would reach German lines. Time meant coordinates transmitted. Time meant artillery falling on 500 American tanks. Men would die, just as they had at Aricourt, when German observers spotted American armor and 88mm shells erased entire companies. So Francies chose differently. He opened his cockpit door, drew his pistol, flew at an enemy aircraft, not because it was heroic, not because it was dramatic, but because waiting was not an option, because sometimes the only way to save lives is to risk your own. That decision defined the kind of officer he had been and the kind of man he became. After the war, Francies continued flying. Commercial aviation, cargo routes, passenger flights, Thousands of hours in aircraft far larger and more powerful than the L-4 Grasshopper. But he never forgot April 11th. Never forgot the Storch circling above Dannenberg. Never forgot the weight of the pistol in his hand. Never forgot the sound of bullets tearing through fabric. Never forgot the face of the wounded German observer lying in the mud. He died on May 5, 2004, at his home in Chehalis, Washington. He was 82 years old, 59 years removed from the war in Europe. He left behind a wife, children, grandchildren, a career of civilian flying, a drawer of medals, among them, the Distinguished Flying Cross he had waited 22 years to receive. And he left behind a story about two men in a tiny observation plane who decided to fight back, about pistols and fabric and courage at 700 feet, about landing behind enemy lines to save a wounded enemy instead of leaving him to die. The last dogfight on the Western Front was not fought by Mustangs, Spitfires, or Thunderbolts. It was fought by an L-4 Grasshopper with 65 horsepower and two .45 caliber pistols. It was fought by men who understood that wars are not won only by the biggest weapons or the fastest aircraft. They are won by soldiers who see what must be done and do it, no matter how small their plane, no matter how inadequate their weapons, no matter how impossible the mission. Merritt Dwayne Francies proved that on April 11, 1945. He proved it again when he bandaged an enemy's wounds instead of turning away. And he proved it one final time by waiting 22 years for recognition, without complaint, without demand, without ever asking for more than the truth.